My adrenal life communities matter because adrenal insufficiency can look stable on paper and still feel chaotic in real life. And that gap is where people start doubting themselves. If your labs are fine, but your body keeps throwing fatigue, brain fog, crashes, or fear at you, that's not a small misunderstanding. That's the whole experience for a lot of people, and it's unsettling.
It's unsettling because the condition sits in this weird place. On one hand, it's medically very clear that cortisol matters for energy, stress response, blood pressure, and day-to-day rhythm. The Endocrine Society and NIDDK both frame adrenal insufficiency that way. The body isn't making enough cortisol, and treatment is replacement, often for life. But the lived experience doesn't always line up neatly with the textbook version. People can do the medication part carefully and still feel like they're building their day on sand. That's where community space becomes more than emotional comfort. It becomes a kind of reality check. Not because the community replaces medical care, but because it names the thing medicine doesn't always have room to name. What it feels like when the plan is technically correct and still not enough.
That gap is the whole story, though. Because people don't usually walk into a support group saying, I need a philosophical framework for cortisol replacement. They show up because something's off and they can't tell if it's them, the dose, the diagnosis, the job, the family, all of it. And when a community keeps surfacing the same kinds of questions, that's not noise. That's data.
Exactly. And I think the article you shared is doing something important by refusing to turn community experience into a fake clinical conclusion. It's not saying everyone with adrenal insufficiency experiences the same thing. It's saying there are repeated patterns here worth taking seriously. That distinction matters a lot. Primary adrenal insufficiency, secondary adrenal insufficiency, tertiary adrenal insufficiency, and steroid-induced adrenal insufficiency aren't the same disease process, but patients across those categories can still run into overlapping issues: fatigue, unpredictable energy, trouble matching treatment to real life, and a constant need to interpret the body instead of just living in it. The article is basically asking, what if the recurring frustration itself is part of the condition's footprint? That's a more honest question than pretending every patient should stabilize in the same way.
And support groups are where that question becomes speakable. Because the first thing chronic illness often steals is not just energy, it's confidence in your own reading of your body. You start asking, is this a real symptom, or am I being dramatic? Is this expected, or am I doing something wrong? A group like My Adrenal Life gives people a place where those questions don't sound embarrassing.
That's a huge point. Chronic illness can isolate you in a very specific way, not just physically, but interpretively. You're left alone with the job of translating symptoms into meaning, and when the symptoms are invisible or inconsistent, that job gets brutal. A community interrupts that by giving you examples, not as a substitute for diagnosis, but as a way of widening the frame. Someone says, I get a delayed crash after I hold it together all week, and another person recognizes themselves. Someone else says, my blood work looked acceptable, but I felt awful. And suddenly there's language for a mismatch that had been haunting them privately. That recognition doesn't cure anything, but it can lower the level of self-doubt enough that a person can think more clearly. That's real clinical value, even if it isn't in a guideline box.
But wait, do support groups ever risk making people feel worse? Because I can hear someone saying, if I spend too much time in a community of sick people, I'm just going to get more anxious and more focused on symptoms. That doesn't feel like an imaginary concern.
No, it's not imaginary at all. There's a real tension there. Any community around illness can become either clarifying or amplifying, depending on how it's used. If every conversation becomes a competition over who feels worse, that's corrosive. If every unusual symptom gets treated like a crisis, that can make people more afraid of their own bodies. But a good support community does something different. It reduces randomness without pretending to remove risk. It says, here are the patterns others have noticed. Here are the questions worth asking. Here's what's normal in the sense of common, not normal in the sense of harmless. For adrenal insufficiency, that can be life-changing because one of the hardest parts is the uncertainty around timing, stress, illness, and recovery. NIDDK and the Endocrine Society both emphasize dose adjustment during illness, surgery, pregnancy, or serious injury, which tells you the condition is deeply responsive to context. A community helps people see that context isn't an afterthought, it's central.
And that context part is where support groups become almost practical medicine, not in a legal sense, in a human sense. Because if you're living with adrenal insufficiency, you're not only managing symptoms, you're managing anticipation. You're asking, what happens if I get sick at work? What happens if I can't keep food down? What if the tiredness I'm feeling is just life, or what if it's a warning? That's a lot of invisible labor.
It is, and I think people underestimate how exhausting it is to live with a condition that has emergency potential built into it. Adrenal crisis is not something patients can afford to be casual about, so even on good days, there's this quiet background scan happening all the time. The body becomes a forecast system. People keep checking themselves for signs of depletion, and that kind of vigilance burns energy by itself. A support group helps because it lets that vigilance be shared. One person says, I thought I was overreacting to a weird symptom, and another says, no, I had the same thing before I crashed. That doesn't replace a clinician, but it can help a person decide when to seek help sooner rather than later. And with adrenal insufficiency, sooner can matter a lot. The literature and guidelines are very clear that patients need education around stress dosing and urgent treatment during severe symptoms or crisis. A community often becomes the place where that education actually sticks because it gets repeated in the language people use at home, at work, and in the middle of fear.
That repetition matters. Medical appointments can be short, and adrenal insufficiency isn't a condition where one neat explanation solves the whole thing. You go in, you get the script, and then real life starts throwing curveballs. The community becomes the place where the script gets tested against Monday morning, the grocery store, the school pickup, the bad night's sleep, the infection that knocks you sideways.
And that's where the article's emphasis on lived patterns is so useful. It's not trying to claim authority over medicine. It's doing something medicine often struggles with, tracking the texture of time. For a lot of chronic illnesses, the issue isn't only the symptom itself, it's the way symptoms accumulate. A person can hold it together through structure, adrenaline, obligation, and then hit a wall later. The article calls that delayed or catch-up fatigue, and honestly, that phrase captures something many patients know but haven't had language for. The wall doesn't feel random to them, but it also doesn't feel predictable enough to plan around. That liminal space is where support communities help most, because other people can say, I know that wall. I've built a whole life around trying not to hit it too hard. That sentence changes the emotional temperature of the experience. Suddenly, you're not a failure with a personal flaw. You're a person managing a pattern.
That phrase, managing a pattern, almost sounds too neat, though. I don't know. Part of me feels like that risks sanitizing how hard it is. Because for some people, it isn't just a pattern. It's rage, grief, fear, and embarrassment all tangled together.
No, that's fair. And actually, that's what makes support groups important. They make room for the emotional consequences, not just the symptom inventory. Chronic illness can produce a grief that doesn't get socially validated because nothing looks dramatic enough from the outside. You're still functioning, sort of. You're still employed, maybe. You're still showing up, more or less, so people assume the internal cost can't be that high. But the article keeps pointing at something deeper. When treatment doesn't fully restore how you expect it to feel, people can end up grieving the version of life they thought would come back. That's not melodrama. That's a real response to a real mismatch. A good community lets someone say, I'm angry that I'm doing everything right and still paying this price, without immediately turning it into a lesson or a silver lining. That kind of honesty is rare, and it matters.
And that honesty can stop self-blame from becoming the default story. Because if no one names the mismatch, people start inventing personal explanations. I'm lazy. I'm not trying hard enough. Maybe I'm just bad at being sick. Those are brutal sentences to carry around.
They are, and they're common. Support spaces are often where those internal scripts get interrupted. Someone hears another person describe the same guilt, the same confusion, the same frustration, and suddenly the story stops being uniquely shameful. That doesn't mean the symptoms vanish. It means the meaning changes. Instead of I'm failing, the possibility opens up that my condition and my daily demands aren't matching cleanly. That's a much more workable problem, It also opens the door to more precise self-advocacy. The article's section on using clearer language is important for exactly that reason. People with chronic illness often have to educate not just clinicians, but family, employers, and even themselves. A support community helps them practice the words. This isn't just tiredness. This is a pattern after exertion. This feels like recovery is slower than expected. Those sentences can sound small, but they're the beginning of being taken seriously.
There's another layer here, though. Support groups aren't only about comfort or language. They can change what people notice. If you've been living in isolation, you may not realize which parts of your experience are actually shared until someone else says them out loud. And then the whole map changes.
That's the word, map. A lot of chronic illness care is about building a usable map when the terrain keeps shifting. In adrenal insufficiency, the terrain can shift because cortisol is tied to stress, blood pressure, energy, and daily rhythm, and replacement therapy can't perfectly recreate the body's natural timing. The literature keeps pointing to this limitation. That doesn't mean treatment is ineffective. It means treatment is constrained. And once you accept that, the role of community gets clearer. A group can help people distinguish between what medicine can do, what it can't do, yet, and what everyday life still demands regardless. That distinction is empowering because it prevents magical thinking on both sides. It keeps hope honest. It also keeps despair from turning into a false conclusion. If your life isn't matching the neat story, the answer isn't automatically that you're doing it wrong. Sometimes the story itself is incomplete.
I'm glad you said constrained, because there's something almost soothing about accuracy there. Not soothing like comforting. Soothing like, finally, the words aren't lying to you.
Exactly. And that's why communities like My Adrenal Life can be so meaningful for people with adrenal insufficiency and other chronic illnesses. They don't just offer sympathy, they offer calibration. They help people see when their experience is unusual but not imaginary, difficult but not personal failure, variable but not meaningless. That's a very specific kind of support, and it's easy to miss if you think the main purpose of a group is just emotional reassurance. The deeper purpose is relational sense-making. When one person says, "I can't tell what's normal anymore," and another says, "Here's what I've seen too," that's not small talk. That's how people build a livable version of reality together. And for a condition where the body can feel unreliable, that shared reality is a huge deal.
But does that shared reality ever become its own pressure? Like, if a community has a strong collective language, could someone feel boxed in by it? Could they start thinking, if my experience doesn't match the group's, maybe I don't belong?
That's a real risk, and I think any serious community has to make room for that. Chronic illness communities can accidentally become too coherent. They can create a version of the illness that feels universal when it's actually only one slice of it. With adrenal insufficiency especially, there are differences across primary, secondary, tertiary, and steroid-induced forms, plus differences in age, coexisting conditions, treatment regimens, and life circumstances. The article is careful about that variability, and it needs to be. The goal can't be to flatten difference into a single narrative. The goal has to be to make more people feel legible. So if someone's story doesn't match the dominant pattern, the community should widen, not narrow. That's the healthy version. Otherwise, support becomes another place where people feel like they're failing at being unwell in the right way, which is a strange and sadly familiar trap.
That's such a bleak sentence. Failing at being unwell in the right way. But it's real. And it explains why people keep returning to community even when the information online is messy. They're not just hunting for facts. They're looking for a place where their version of hard isn't dismissed because it's not the most dramatic version.
And that's where community has moral weight, not just practical value. It tells people their experience is worth noticing before it becomes fully legible to the healthcare system. That matters in rare diseases especially, where people can spend years feeling strange, doubted, or underexplained. The NIH and Endocrine Society resources are important precisely because they offer reliable, science-based grounding. But the lived layer still needs a home. Support groups are that home when they're working well. They're where someone can say, "I know the guideline, I know the theory, but I still feel awful on Tuesdays," and the room doesn't laugh. It listens. Then somebody else says, "Mine's Thursdays," and suddenly, that's not trivial. That's a clue about pacing, about stress, about recovery, about the mismatch between a neat schedule and a messy body.
And sometimes that clue is enough to change a life, even if it doesn't change the disease, because the person stops treating their own experience as a mystery to solve alone. They start treating it as information they can actually use.
That's the shift. Not cure, but usability. Not fantasy certainty, but a more precise relationship to reality. And for chronic illness, that can be the difference between spiraling and adapting. The article keeps circling that idea without overclaiming. It says patterns aren't diagnoses, but they can still guide understanding. That's a very mature stance. It honors uncertainty without surrendering to it. And it's exactly why communities like My Adrenal Life matter. They create a place where repeated experience can become shared language, where shared language can become self-understanding, and where self-understanding can make care feel less like guessing in the dark. For someone with adrenal insufficiency, that can mean less shame, better questions, and maybe a little more room to breathe inside a condition that doesn't give much room at all.
That's the part I keep coming back to. Not that community solves the condition. It doesn't. But it can stop isolation from becoming part of the diagnosis.
And that's not a small thing. When people talk about support groups, they sometimes make them sound optional, like a nice add-on if you have time. For chronic illness, especially something as demanding as adrenal insufficiency, community can be part of the infrastructure of survival. Not because everyone needs the same kind of support, and not because every group is perfect, but because shared language, shared patterns, and shared permission to be confused are all protective. The article understands that. It's asking people to look at what keeps surfacing across the community and take it seriously, not as proof of one simple answer, but as evidence that lived experience has structure. And once you start seeing that structure, you can't unsee how much of illness is carried socially, not just biologically.
And maybe that's the quiet point underneath all of it. Adrenal insufficiency doesn't just happen inside the body. It gets interpreted in kitchens, in group chats, in waiting rooms, in support threads, in the moments when someone finally says, "I thought I was the only one."
That sentence does a lot of work. It turns private panic into shared recognition. It doesn't erase the condition, but it changes the loneliness around it. And for people living with adrenal insufficiency or any chronic illness, that shift can be as important as a chart note, sometimes more. The My Adrenal Life community is valuable because it makes room for that shift to happen over and over again. That's what the best communities do. They don't hand out certainty, they hand out company, language, and a more truthful way of seeing what's already there.
If this hit close to home, send it to someone who gets the hidden work of chronic illness. And if a support group has ever helped you make sense of your own symptoms, pass this along to the person who needed that conversation first.